It was one of those mornings when the city seems to drift loose from time. Oxford in mist, not the hard, assertive fog of London, but something gentler, the kind that presses against your collar like a forgotten regret. I had crossed Magdalen Bridge just after 7, the bells still sleepwalking their way through the half-light, and found myself thinking, as I often do in such weather, of Swinburne. Time and the gods are at strife. But that wasn't quite it, the line snagged somewhere in the folds of memory, refusing to unfold. A poet with a fondness for ash and ruin, who knew a thing or two about what doesn't burn. The call had come at 6, from Lewis, apologetic as ever, though I suspect not for waking me, only for the case itself. He never said so directly, but there was a tension in his voice like a man asking someone to come home. Perhaps I had been gone longer than I'd meant to. I had taken a room in Devon, near nothing, with no intention other than to sleep, and yet even there I had managed only half of that ambition. You cannot outrun yourself with silence. The echo grows louder. The cottage sat just north of Nettletonstoke, a name that always sounded to me like a defeated bishop or a retired spy. I knew the village vaguely, a lace of lanes and hedgerows, pubs where old men argued about sheep and modernity, and a chapel whose bell no longer rang. The Vale property lay at the end of a narrow path, hidden behind a twisted yew and a dry stone wall beginning to crumble, as if the house itself had decided to retreat from the world. Lewis was already there, coat flapping in the breeze like a man still undecided about staying. He greeted me with a nod, but his eyes carried that patient exasperation which only arises when one has been waiting too long for someone who is inevitably late. I offered him nothing by way of apology. He has long since stopped expecting it, and followed him inside. The air had that stale, clinging weight which follows a fire. Though none had burned here, the hearth stood immaculate. Not a trace of soot, not a curl of wood, not even the metallic reek of old smoke. Yet Miss Cedric Vale, late of Merton College, I would later learn had died, ostensibly, of smoke inhalation. There had been no struggle, no sign of forced entry. The door locked from within, the windows fastened. A mystery with the polite manners of a suicide, but none of the despair. I knelt briefly beside the body. He looked peaceful, that unnerving calm the dead sometimes manage, as if their final thoughts had been of nothing terribly urgent. A well-groomed man in his 60s, with the kind of hands that either played the cello or turned pages with too much delicacy. On the table beside him, a half-finished cup of Darjeeling and the Oxford Book of Literary Quotations, opened not randomly, but at a page he had clearly marked, a sliver of blue ribbon between lines by Marvel and Dunn. I noted the place, closed the book carefully. There are small courtesies we owe the dead, even those we never knew. Lewis murmured something about the electric fire being switched on, one of those modern contraptions meant to mimic flame, without its inconvenience. I nodded, though I distrusted such things. A fire that cannot burn is a strange comfort. Still, the setting was tidy, almost too deliberate. A death arranged with a curator's eye. I walked to the room again, slowly. No overturned chairs, no wine glass on the floor. Only the smallest of oddities, a matchstick in the ashtray, its end charred though nothing else showed signs of ignition. An old tin box on the mantel, closed. A single muddy footprint on the inner side of the doorway, left not right. I mentioned it to Lewis, who crouched to look, frowned, and said he hadn't noticed. Nor, to be fair, had I until I stepped back to tie a shoelace and caught the light slanting across it. We stood a while longer, saying little. Outside, the morning had begun to shift. Light, thinning the mist, but never quite banishing it. I looked again at the book on the table. It would have meant something to Vale. That kind of man didn't read quotation compilations idly. They used them as maps, or compasses, or occasionally alibis. Lewis broke the silence. Retired bookseller, he said. Former lecturer. Lived alone. No known family. But and here he paused in that way he does when baiting a hook. The village vicar says he was once a don. Taught English at Oxford, years ago. Bit of a recluse since then. That was when I felt the tug. A death, I might otherwise have left to the coroner, had just acquired an aftertaste of literature. I have never trusted deaths that quote poets, so I nodded, once, and said we'd take it, because I knew, already, there was something wrong. Not just with the fire that hadn't burned, but with the man who'd sat beside it, waiting, perhaps, for someone to join him, or to arrive too late. There's a particular kind of quiet that clings to old bookshops. Not silence, not quite, but something more considered, like the hush of a chapel long since abandoned to the dust. Vale's shop lay folded into a sliver of Corn Market. I'd not walked in some years, wedged between a tailor who'd ceased updating his window mannequins sometime during the major government, and a watchmaker who dealt only in timepieces that no longer told time. The bell above the door gave a reluctant chime as we stepped inside, as though objecting to the presence of the living. The place smelled reassuringly of leather bindings, pipe smoke, and old regret. Tall shelves rose like weary sentinels, sagging slightly under the weight of authors who had outlived their readers. There was no music, no curated ambience, only the gentle creak of timber and the low tick of a grandfather clock that had stopped just before noon. Lewis muttered that he couldn't imagine anyone coming in here by accident. I replied that was rather the point. There are places meant to be found only by those who already know them. The woman behind the counter introduced herself as Miss Brockenhurst, Vale's assistant, though she corrected that term with the word custodian. Late 50s, sensible shoes and a gaze that had clearly read more than it spoke. She told us, with something like reverence, that Mr. Vale had kept the shop not for profit, but preservation. Books, she said, remember for us what we choose to forget. Vale's office sat behind a green curtain, drawn back as if he might return at any moment to resume his careful cataloguing. A desk bearing the clutter of a mind too organized to be untidy, yet too restless to be neat. A fountain pen still uncapped. A half-written letter beginning with Dear Sylvia, and trailing off without a full stop. She, it turned out, was the heir. Sylvia Prynne, former student, now best-selling writer of the sort of crime novels Lewis's wife might read on holiday. I'd heard the name vaguely. Her books were lean, stylish, self-aware, the sort of fiction that pretended not to notice its own intelligence. We were given an address in Jericho, and told she preferred to be called Ms. Lewis. Rolled his eyes a little at that, but I said nothing. Her flat overlooked the canal, the kind of building developers call heritage, but which is, in truth, just old enough to be haunted. She opened the door without enthusiasm, but without surprise either, as if she'd already guessed it would be us. A woman in her 40s, I'd say, though not easily pinned down. Black turtleneck, hair like dusk, and eyes the color of slate left out in the rain. She offered us no tea, which I respected, and spoke with the studied calm of someone who has spent a lifetime revising first drafts. I asked how long she had known Vale. Since I was 19, she said. He was my tutor. Then he became something else. She left that hanging, not an evasion exactly, more a subtle rephrasing of silence. I waited. He left everything to you. Yes, I didn't ask for it. Do you usually inherit bookshops and cottages from men you used to study under? A flicker of a smile. Only the very dead ones. There was something rehearsed in her speech, but nothing insincere. She was used to interviews, perhaps, people who asked questions expecting answers. I asked none, and so she watched me more carefully. I liked her, or rather, I recognized in her that quiet layering of grief and intellect one only earns by surviving the damage clever men do. Back at the cottage later that evening, I walked the room again. The cracked tile near the hearth caught my eye. A thin fracture running diagonally across the glaze, like a scar. It hadn't been there in the photographs. Lewis confirmed it, almost proudly, as if noticing damage were a kind of progress. I said nothing but knelt to touch it, cold, unyielding. On the table beside the Marvel and Donne, I found the copy of King Lear Lewis had catalogued, and half dismissed. I flipped it open without intent, and there it was. Not underlined, Not annotated, just written, clumsily, almost like a child had scrawled it with distracted fury, in the margin of Act 1, Scene I. Nothing will come of nothing. I stood there a moment longer than I should have, and Lewis, noticing, asked if it meant something. It always does, I said, and I didn't tell him that it was the very phrase I'd found myself whispering to no one when I woke in Devon last week, the sea pounding against the cliff like a heartbeat out of time. I left the house that night with the growing suspicion that Vale's death hadn't been arranged to vanish. Not entirely. Something had been left. A footprint. A crack. A line of Shakespeare thrown like a rope to whoever was clever enough or lonely enough to reach for it. It had rained overnight, the sort that slicks the stones and blackens the mortar, until Oxford feels less like a city and more like an old photograph slowly developing in silver and damp. Christchurch loomed through the thinning drizzle, all bell towers and proud silence, the kind of architecture that seems vaguely disappointed in the present. I always approach it with something between reverence and resentment, like visiting the childhood home of a parent you've outlived. Lewis, as ever, stepped a pace behind, boots louder than mine. I could tell he disliked the place, or perhaps, more precisely, the people who preferred it to the world beyond its gates, but he kept his observations to himself, out of either respect or weariness, and I was grateful. We were met in the senior common room by the master, Dr. Marcus Farrow, a man whose handshake lasted no longer than the bare necessity of civility, and whose eyes held that vague shimmer of intelligence no longer bothered by imagination. The room smelled of polish and rain-damp wool. Someone had lit a fire, more for effect than heat, and the orange glow did little to soften the austerity of the furnishings. Dr. Farrow motioned toward 2 chairs, declined to sit himself, and referred to Vale as one might speak of an outgrown overcoat. Cedric was complicated, a romantic in an age that had no time for such indulgence. He left when the department began insisting our students think rather than feel. I always suspected he felt safer among old books than young minds. And the suicide, he said this without pause, as though it were a footnote, regrettable but ultimately irrelevant to the central argument. A tragedy. Yes. Though not, I think, Cedric's fault. Students come to us already broken, Mr. Morse. We simply illuminate the crack. There was a painting above the fireplace. A poet, anonymous, unnamed, the kind who wore a laurel crown with more conviction than comfort. It took me a moment to notice what was wrong. The eyes had been scraped away, not brutally but with the patient precision of someone determined to remove only what mattered. The sockets left behind were raw, chalky voids. I stared at them a moment too long. Did Cedric ever speak of his time here? I asked. Dr. Farrow offered a brittle smile. Rarely. But I once overheard him telling a student that memory is not a record, it's a revenge. I've never quite decided whether he meant it in jest. As we stepped out, Lewis muttered that Farrow made a convincing ghost even in daylight. I agreed, though I said it was a shame more ghosts weren't so forthcoming. We paused in the quad. Pigeons pecked listlessly at nothing. I asked Lewis what the forensics team had concluded about the fireplace. Electric, he said. Brand new. No sign it was faulty. But here's the thing. We found a whole box of matches in the kitchen drawer, and 2 burnt ones in the ashtray. But there was nothing to burn. No logs, no embers, just the fire effect thing humming away. So he struck a match with no intention of lighting anything. I said. Lewis shrugged. Or someone else did. Before or after? I turned that over for a while as we walked. The idea of flame without purpose. It reminded me of something. A lecture I once endured about St. Elmo's fire. Or was it foxfire? Illusions in the dark, light without substance. Later that afternoon, I went through Vale's coat again. The pockets had been emptied, catalogued, bagged, but I asked to see them anyway. The constable obliged, somewhat begrudgingly, and I unfolded the crumpled crossword tucked into the lining. Most of it was half-solved, with the slightly hesitant script of a man still testing his certainty. A few of the clues had dates penciled beside them. suggesting he liked to save them, perhaps retry them weeks later, to see if his mind had improved. One clue stood out. Ignis Fatuus 9. No answer. No attempt, even. Just the clue, underlined faintly, once, then again harder. I handed it back without comment. That night I sat by my own fire, the real kind, and thought of illusions, lights that lead men into bogs, flames that burn cold. A man who left the university after a student's death, only to die decades later with a fireplace blazing nothing. What is it, I wondered, that lingers in places like this? Not ghosts, but something quieter. Remnants of intention. Motives left unlit, like matches struck in darkness for no reason except the momentary flare of possibility. And I thought again of the scraped eyes in the portrait. What is a face when it no longer sees? The answer would not come, not yet. But I began to feel it then, that slow, deliberate tightening of a thread I hadn't meant to pull. The manuscript arrived in a plain envelope without a note, as if to make it clear that it had been sent, not shared. The address was typed, the return label unsigned. A gesture, I thought, of calculated detachment. I had requested it in person 2 days prior, sitting across from Sylvia Prynne, while the wind outside her Jericho flat rearranged leaves into small, unreadable hieroglyphs against the window pane. She'd paused for a long time before answering, one hand resting lightly on a glass of red wine that she hadn't touched. Her eyes didn't move from mine, gray eyes not sharp but dulled in that particular way only knowledge can dull. Finally, she said, "You can read it, but you won't find what you're looking for. Writers aren't reliable witnesses, especially when writing about themselves." I told her I wasn't looking for the truth, just something approximate. She smiled, but it was the kind that leaves behind a silence. Now the manuscript sat on my kitchen table like an unopened letter from an old friend who never quite forgave you. It was titled The Fall and the Furnace. A clever, literary sort of name. I read the first few pages standing, then the rest in a single sitting, my tea growing cold beside me, untouched. The protagonist was a woman in her early 20s, bright, brittle, half-formed in the way we all were at that age. She meets an older tutor, urbane, distant, quick to praise but quicker still to disappear when the emotional tab comes due. He doesn't seduce her exactly. He merely opens the door and watches her walk through it. The relationship is never named as such, but its aftermath colors everything. Years later, the tutor dies in what appears to be an accident, but the woman suspects otherwise, not because of evidence, but because of the way absence can haunt more sharply than presence. I closed the manuscript and lit a cigarette, knowing it wouldn't help. Outside, the city was beginning to settle into that particular kind of Oxford dusk, somewhere between resignation and ritual, the sort of light that asks more than it answers. Sylvia's writing was spare, precise. She knew exactly when to leave a line unfinished, and when to press just hard enough on a metaphor to bruise it. I saw her, or thought I did, somewhere between the lines, not confessing but curating, offering just enough of herself to distract you from what she withheld. That evening, I returned to Vale's copy of the Riverside Shakespeare, the one with the leather spine so cracked it had started to flake at the corners like peeling bark. I opened it where I had found it before, King Lear, but this time read outward, tracing the margin notes like a map with missing borders. He had annotated Lear sparsely, but with intent. One line, "Nothing will come of nothing," had been circled twice in blue ink. Another, fainter, beside it, "I am a man more sinned against than sinning." And then in Hamlet, near the soliloquies, his handwriting became more angular, urgent. He had written words, 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 beside Hamlet's weary response to Polonius, and underlined, "Give me that man that is not passion's slave," in a hand that suggested something more than literary interest. I turned to the back cover and found an index Vale had started to make for himself, fragments and page numbers, no explanations. One entry read simply, "The Fire Sermon, C. Eliot, C." I retrieved my own well-thumbed collected poems, flipping to the line I suspected he meant, "Burning, burning, burning, burning." There was something desperate in the repetition, something not quite metaphor. And then, tucked between pages of The Tempest, a scrap of loose leaf, an unfinished note or a draft perhaps. The ink was Vale's. It read, Quarter 1. The beginning must burn, or nothing can follow. I frowned. Quarter, not chapter. A slip of the pen perhaps. But Vale didn't make slips, not in ink, not in language. I underlined it and read twice. A wound closed by fire. A beginning that sears before it opens. A man who dies beside an artificial flame that leaves no ashes. I folded the manuscript back into its envelope and placed it beside the cigarette tin I no longer trusted myself with. Sylvia had said the genre trades in ambiguity, but I wasn't so sure anymore. Sometimes fiction tells the truth too precisely. Not by what it says, but by the things it chooses not to forget. The diary came to us through accident or carelessness, though I've never quite trusted the difference. A brown paper parcel, unearthed during Lewis's increasingly reluctant trawling of the Vale property. Shoved behind a filing cabinet that bore dust like a coat of self-pity, he had been trying to find an electrical bill, something dull and practical. Instead, he found Ewan Gill, the boy, though he was 20 when he died, and I suppose that makes him a man in some ledgers, had once shown real promise. Lewis said the name with the weariness of someone who'd read too far ahead. I asked to see the diary, and he hesitated, not out of protectiveness, but a kind of spiritual recoil. Then he handed it over, and I understood. It was a hardback notebook, bound in cloth, the color of dried blood, faded enough to pass as rust. The first entries were perfectly legible, though written in the sort of hand that fancies itself elegant, until pressure reveals the fault lines, the usual mix of literary detritus and youthful observation lines of Yeats misquoted beside shopping lists, stray thoughts about Oxford's impossible beauty, and odd, aching questions like how does one walk backward into the future and not be mistaken for man? But then the entries changed. Slowly, as if a fog crept across the pages, one thought at a time. Gill began referring to someone only as he, and it was not difficult to infer who. Vale appeared first as a presence, admired, then studied, then watched. A man of silences, Gill wrote, a man who never quite answered the question you asked, only the one you should have. There were passages that made me uncomfortable, though not for their content, which was never explicit, but for the way Gill clung to him, with a devotion that had outgrown its object. Not infatuation, not quite. Something more theological, a kind of intellectual worship, which is always the most dangerous kind. That peculiar kind of madness, reserved for the very clever. Then, there was a new figure, a woman, described only as the one who watches. Gill never named her, only sketched fragments of her presence in the margins of his prose. She sits near the archway again, watches, always, speaks in riddles. Knows what I know before I say it. Sylvia came to mind. Of course she did, but something in the tone felt off, too reverent, too uncertain. Sylvia, whatever else she was, did not strike me as enigmatic. Guarded, yes. But Gill had seen this woman as something mythic, as if her silence shaped the world around her. I wasn't sure Sylvia would have had the patience for that role. Lewis leaned in as I read, eyes narrowing when I stopped on one particular line. The fire must cleanse, but it leaves no mark. That's how he taught me. He said it softly, more question than statement. You don't think Vale was, I don't know, running some sort of thing, do you? A cult or whatever. I looked at him and didn't reply. Not because the idea was absurd, although it was, but because something more unsettling had occurred to me. The line. It wasn't Vale's voice I heard in it, nor Gill's. It sounded written, scripted, like a line from a play left half rehearsed. I took out my notebook, the black one, the one I never show Lewis, and copied the phrase carefully. The fire must cleanse, but it leaves no mark. There was more to the diary, odd diagrams that meant nothing, fragmented lines from the wasteland, a pasted clipping from a fire at a theater in Leeds that had killed no one but destroyed everything. And then, in the final pages, almost an afterthought, A list of crossword clues. Most had answers scribbled beside them, all except one. Silent, heat, senseless flame. 7. I tapped the page twice and left my pencil resting on the spine. It was an unusual clue. Obscure. But there was an elegance to it. A kind of unspoken metaphor. I murmured it aloud, and let the words settle in the room like ash. Lewis shifted beside me. You think he meant to kill himself? I shrugged. It's possible, but if so, it was the kind of suicide one prepares like a performance, carefully staged, full of references. A private tragedy dressed up as public literature. Gil had drowned himself in the Isis. Years ago now. They'd said it was sudden, but nothing in this diary suggested swiftness. It was slow, a studied descent. One so calm that I wondered if he had rehearsed it long before the final walk. That night I sat alone with the crossword clue and tried every permutation. Inferno was too long. Blazes, too cheerful. Then it came to me, unbidden, just as I'd decided to put the thing aside. Chimera, 7 letters. A flame that means nothing. An illusion with the weight of myth. I didn't write it down. Not yet. But I folded the diary closed and stared at the fire in my grate. Somewhere, I thought, there's another copy of this play, and someone still reading from it. She lived above a shuttered cafe in Jericho, the sort of building whose bricks still held the coal smoke of a century ago. The windows warping light like bad glass in a church. The bell didn't work, and I had to knock 3 times before the door opened a hesitant inch, then 2. Amelia Farrow looked older than her years, though not in the way that suggests decay, more like a woman who had been slowly rubbed away, one layer at a time, until what remained was raw and permanent. Her hair was too long to be careless and too tangled to be styled, and her eyes had the unfocused inwardness of someone still finishing a thought that began years ago. You're the detective, she said, stepping aside without waiting for confirmation. Her voice had the hollow weight of a voice not often used. The flat was warm in the way of places that have given up fighting the cold. Melted candles stood in chipped teacups. Books, not stacked so much as nested, cluttered every surface, their spines half-eaten by dust and age. I recognized a few from my own youth. Wyndham Lewis, H.D., obscure translations of Rimbaud, all lovingly injured by time. He never burned anything, she said, as if we were mid-conversation. Not once. He rewrote it, again and again, until the original vanished. That was his way. I asked her if she meant veil, and she gave a vague nod, curling into the arm of a threadbare chair like a cat choosing not to sleep. He was your tutor. For 1 year. Then he said I no longer needed him. I thought it was praise. Later I understood. Understood what? That I'd stopped being useful to his work. She said the word useful with a peculiar delicacy, as though it bruised the tongue. There was no bitterness in her tone, only the cool distance of someone used to being overwritten. You knew Sylvia. Of course. Were you friends? Amelia smiled at that. Faintly. We were similar, she said, which is never the same as being close. Cedric liked to teach in mirrors. He watched us reflect him back. Did you read her latest manuscript? I wrote it, she said simply, or most of it. But it's hers now. She took the scaffolding and built something clever on top. I'm still living in the basement. It was not quite accusation, not quite confession. I let the silence stretch between us and watched her stare at the flame of a candle as if it owed her something. What did you mean about him rewriting things until they disappeared? She stood then abruptly and crossed to a shelf lined with first editions, whose covers had begun to blister. She plucked a small volume from the row. Poems by Ewan Gill, privately printed, the title fading into the cover like breath on glass. This wasn't published in his lifetime, she said. Cedric put it together after the suicide. But look here. She opened to a page, ran her finger down a stanza. This line. The heat that leaves no mark. It's not Ewan's, it's Cedric's. I heard him say it once, in a seminar. I wrote it down in my notes. A year later, it turned up here. That's what I mean. He kept rewriting things until no one remembered the original, not even the author. And you remembered. Not everything. Just enough to know what I lost. She handed me the book and turned away. Her back was straighter than I expected. Why are you telling me this? Because he's dead now. And so is Ewan. And Sylvia's the only one still clapping at the end of the performance. I left her with the candlelight and the paper ruins. The air smelled faintly of wax and ink, like a church that had forgotten what prayers sounded like. Outside, the cold met me without ceremony. I walked slowly, the book still under my arm. Vale, Sylvia, Amelia, a closed loop of memory and invention, all of them narrating the same story in different tenses, rewriting each other with the slow cruelty only scholars can muster. And I thought, not for the first time, that intimacy and distance are two sides of the same habit. That to observe too much is simply to defer affection. That we who linger in footnotes and margins often find it easier to study pain than to share it. I opened the book again beneath a street lamp. The poem stared back, voiceless. The fire must cleanse, it read, but it leaves no mark. No mark, I thought. And yet here we are, tracing it still. There's a particular type of event held at the Bodleian. Elegant, overly warm, mildly soporific, where the speeches go on longer than the truths they pretend to honor. They are rituals, really, not for celebration but for recognition, a way for the old to anoint the younger versions of themselves, and for the young to observe the subtle horror of what they may become. Sylvia was there, of course, dressed with precision, if not ornament, a charcoal coat, hair pinned back in a way that seemed both careless and deliberate. I had seen her name listed on the program, literature as witness, the novelist and moral invention, a panel discussion that sounded like a crime without a victim. I watched from the edge of the room, close enough to hear, far enough to remain unaddressed. She spoke well, she always had, in long, calibrated sentences that did not so much conclude as dissipate. The audience, mostly students and those who still pretended to be, nodded earnestly. I waited. Afterward, amid the dull clatter of post-talk wine glasses and murmured gratitude, I stepped in. I read your manuscript again. She didn't turn. Did you? It reads differently now. She turned then, slow and without surprise. Everything reads differently when you know how it ends. You knew Ewan Gill. Her lips parted, not in shock, but something quieter. Memory, perhaps. Then, everyone knew Ewan. He was brilliant, and completely wrong for this world. Did he love you? That made her laugh quietly. He loved something. It may have been me, or it may have been the idea of me filtered through too many sonnets. And Vale. She stared past me, through the stained glass to the drizzle outside. Vale loved nothing. That's what made him dangerous. People think cruelty is what wounds us. But it's indifference that buries us. He left everything to you, only because he'd already taken what mattered. I took a breath. You wrote about him, in that book. The coldness, the manipulation, the death. It's all there. Fiction, she said. As you know, trades in ambiguity. But that line, the fire must cleanse but leave no mark, that's not fiction. That's Ewan. Or perhaps it was Vale. Or perhaps it was you. She leaned in, close enough that I could see the faint tremble just beneath her composure. And death shall be no more, she said quietly. Death, thou shalt die. I left her there, among the donors and decanters, her face unreadable under the vaulted lights. There are women who write with such clarity that their lives become unreadable by necessity. Sylvia was one of them. She had made her pain so precise on the page that no one thought to ask how often she bled off it. That night, I dreamt of a fireplace again. This time it was glowing, but there was no heat, just the illusion of comfort. Orange light, rippling across an empty grate. I stood before it in the dream for what felt like hours, until I saw that what flickered inside was not fire at all, but text lines from a book I had never written. When I woke, My shirt clung damply to my back, as if I'd stood too close to something burning. Lewis rang just past 7. His voice carried that particular breathlessness that means he's found something he doesn't yet understand. "There's a compartment, sir. Behind Vale's bookcase, well hidden. You'd never spot it unless you were dusting, and he never did." "What was in it?" "Just a page, part of a will, dated 20 years ago. Says everything goes to AF. I think that's Amelia Farrow." "It is." "So he changed it. From her to Sylvia." I didn't answer. "We're getting it dated properly, but it looks genuine. The ink's aged. Could be important." "Yes, Lewis," I said. "It could." I rang off, sat in the dark a while longer. I thought of Amelia's flat, the candles, the broken-spined books, her voice barely louder than the scratch of a pen on paper. I thought of the way she'd said I'm still living in the basement, as though the house she meant wasn't real, but some larger, older structure, built by men who never knew how to live in the same room as the women they tutored, or praised, or slowly erased. And I thought of Sylvia, quoting Donne like a talisman, standing amid the ruins of her own architecture. The fire was never meant to warm. It was meant to erase. But someone had left a match unstruck. It was late morning when I found myself once more in the cloistered hush of Christ Church. The air held that papery dryness, particular to colleges, where time is measured in degrees of silence, and the echo of one's own steps feels like an intrusion. Dr. Marcus Farrow had agreed to see me, reluctantly I assumed, though he greeted me with the precise civility that passes for warmth among the Danish elite. I had no real agenda, or rather I was hoping the lack of one might coax something unguarded. Sometimes a mind like Farrow's needs to be observed sidelong, like a stain in a mirror. We sat in his room, overlooking the quad, the fireplace dead but ornamental, ashless, like the one at Vale's cottage. The metaphor, if there was one, eluded me. "It's unfortunate what happened to Cedric," Farrow said, pouring tea with a care I didn't believe in, but he was always a man of peculiar instincts. He liked to burn evidence, metaphorically speaking. I watched the steam rise between us, reluctant to interrupt. He prided himself on disappearance. Farrow continued. He would say often, in fact, that literature was best when the author had no fingerprints. That's why he admired Eliot. The man was all mask. I waited, something faintly unsettled flickering behind my ribs. "Did he ever quote Eliot to you?" Farrow frowned. "Frequently. That was his form of conversation. This is the way the world ends, that sort of thing. All very literary, slightly tedious." I left shortly after, but the phrase clung to me. Not for its banality, though it had been quoted into oblivion, but for something else. Something that refused to settle. I returned to my flat and opened the notebook I had taken from Vale's cottage. The margin notes, cryptic, obsessive, riddled with literary allusions, were underlined in various inks. One, in particular, had always struck me as curiously resonant. "Ash is the silence of memory, flame only its ghost." Vale had scribbled Eliot beside it, but Eliot had never written that. I knew this because it was not Eliot's rhythm. It lacked that coagulated modernist talk, the compression of agony into meter. No, this was something more recent, less refined. I turned to the slim, self-published volume of Ewan Gill's poetry, the one Amelia had shown me. And there it was, tucked in the third section, beneath a title that made no sense until now. Conflagrations without heat. Ash is the silence of memory, flame only its ghost. Identical. So Vale had quoted Gill and attributed it to Eliot, not in passing, not mistakenly, in annotation, his most sacred space. It's a small thing, a misquote. But it felt like a hinge creaking open. If Vale had passed Gill's lines off as Eliot's, whether to himself or to others, the theft wasn't just literary. It was spiritual. It was the quiet, callous absorption of a voice already silenced. And worse, Sylvia had used the same line in her manuscript. That specific phrasing. Not similar. Exact. I made a list then. Lines from Gil's diary, lines from Vale's notes, and passages from Sylvia's novel. The overlaps were chilling, not in content, but in cadence. What they shared was something deeper than words. They shared absence, a curated silence stitched from someone else's grief. So this was the motive, I thought. Not money, not passion, but legacy. Ewan Gil had died a ghost. Vale had rewritten him into someone else's myth. Sylvia, perhaps unconsciously, had canonized that theft into fiction. Amelia, the forgotten, the marginalized, had watched it all from the footnotes. It should have been enough. And yet, it didn't explain the room. That cursed room in the cottage. The false fire. The absence of logs. The lack of ash. No fuel. No burn. And yet he'd choked. The coroner's report had been clear. Smoke inhalation. Smoke without fire. As if someone had conjured only the ending of a flame, bypassing the heat altogether. An artificial death, as staged as a poem. And still, it lingered. That single crossword clue from his coat pocket. Ignis fatuus. 9. The Latin drifted through me now, with unpleasant clarity. Foolish fire. A will-o'-the-wisp. A deceptive flame that leads travelers into the mire. I leaned back in my chair, the edges of meaning beginning to gather like dusk. I thought again of Pharaoh's remark, burning the evidence, and of the quote Vale had misattributed. Who had really written anything? Who had erased whom? In the margin of my own notebook, I wrote the word slowly, plagiarism, and underneath, a second line, one I didn't yet understand, forgery. It came to me, not with thunder or lightning, but like the hush after an aria, one of those slow, exacting movements of thought, where everything shifts almost imperceptibly into its proper place. The crossword had continued to bother me. It was never just a crossword with Vale. His puzzles were palimpsests, old meanings hiding beneath new ones. The clue, ignis fatuus, 9, had remained unanswered in his coat pocket. Will-o'-the-wisp, that deceptive light that flickers above the bog, leading the unwary into darkness. A false promise. A ghost of heat. It was the other clue, too, that had resurfaced. Silent heat, senseless flame. 7. The words felt less poetic now, more practical. Silent heat. What makes heat without sound? And what kind of flame leaves no light, no smoke, no ash? I returned to the photograph taken of Vale's sitting room, one of those overlit forensic shots that always manages to rob a room of its dignity. Yet something in the composition nudged at me. My eyes found the hearth again, empty. No logs, no grate marks, no residue, but just to the left, barely noticeable behind a wooden side table, there it was, a plug socket. I'd seen it before, but this time I noticed the darkness haloing its edges, a scorch mark, faint, like a thumbprint on old parchment. The prongs of the plug itself were slightly ajar, not fully seated, as though pulled free in haste, or tampered with. A sick realization began to form. Not fire, then, not in the old sense. No blaze, no fuel, just a current. Electricity. The fireplace had been a simulation, the kind that glows prettily behind glass while producing a discreet heat from within. Artificial comfort. But if you were to block the vent, reverse the polarity, meddle with the internal wiring, carbon monoxide, odorless, quiet, a thief of breath, a slow, invisible death. The forensic report had mentioned elevated CO levels, nothing dramatic, but enough. Enough, if he'd been asleep, or drunk, or lulled into trust by the gentle hum of something he thought he understood. And now Amelia's words returned to me too clear now to ignore. He never burned anything, only rewrote it until it disappeared. I sat for a long time with those words. Rewriting. Disappearing. The art of erasure disguised as homage. Sylvia's guilt had shimmered for me, all style and silence. But it was, I now suspected, a decoy. She had no need to kill Vale. She had already succeeded him, in print, in myth, in every room where people spoke of him as that old Don who mentored her. Her motive had always been metaphorical. But Amelia, she'd been written out entirely. The will fragment we'd found behind Vale's bookshelf, that brittle, unsigned page, had left the estate to her. A.F. Amelia Farrow. A name later replaced by Sylvia's in the final version. Why? Because, perhaps, she had become inconvenient. Mad, maybe, or simply unprofitable. A recluse can't do interviews, and Vale, I now saw, had always been building monuments to himself through other people's hands. Amelia's flat, those melted candles, the bruised books, the drifting piles of paper. It wasn't eccentricity, it was aftermath, grief, not guilt, which left the method and the means. Amelia had studied physics before literature, a fact buried in her student record, which Lewis had skimmed without interest. She would have known how an electric fireplace worked, how it could be made not to work. The cruelty of it lay in its subtlety. No struggle, no flame, just the illusion of warmth, until the breath left you. And yet, I hesitated, because there was still something unsaid, something unreckoned. She hadn't run, she hadn't hidden, she'd spoken to me plainly, if in riddles, and when she said Vale never burned anything, she had not been lying. Perhaps she had not murdered at all. Perhaps the scene had been staged to look like someone had. A suicide then. But one of theater, an elaborate last act casting suspicion as retribution. I wrote the possibilities out in my notebook, crossed them, rewrote them, and still the crossword sat unanswered beside me. Ignis fatuus. The fire that leads nowhere. Was that what Vale had followed, or had Amelia placed it in his path? I sat there, unmoving, as dusk gathered at the window. Somewhere in the quad below, a bicycle wheel clicked once, then stopped. The clue still lay open. The answer hovered. I just couldn't name it yet. It ended, or rather, it ceased to continue, in the Bodleian's quietest alcove, that odd, forgotten corner behind theology, where the catalogue drawers still bore the fingerprint of every decade since 1890. Dust never settled there. It arranged itself respectfully. The book was misplaced, or not quite. A second-hand edition of The Wasteland, its spine repaired with cellophane tape, the cover brittle at the corners. I hadn't expected to find it. And yet I had known, too, with the same instinct that tells one where the lost cufflink has rolled or which window has been left just slightly ajar. On the inside leaf, a faded inscription, barely visible beneath layers of erased graphite and overwriting. Someone had tried to obliterate it, then changed their mind. You could see the hesitation in the ink, the tremor in the loop of the to is the fire that stays within. C.V. Cedric Vale. It was hers. Then, Amelia's. A gift once, or perhaps a tether. There was something so deliberate in the phrasing, the fire that stays within. Not the fire that warms, not the fire that burns, just the one that remains. It was the last piece. I returned to her flat. She had already gone. The candles were gone too, or rather melted down to their nubs, curled into themselves like exhausted limbs. The books were still there, though less numerous, as though she had taken only what was necessary. Eliot, Platt, a crumpled paperback of the bell jar which I doubted she had enjoyed but seemed unwilling to discard. On the table, a single cigarette had been half-smoked and left upright in a teacup. The matchbook beside it was unopened. Lewis arrived shortly after, breath catching slightly in the stairwell. He had gone to her university contact. No forwarding address. No family. No. She had slipped through the cracks. Again. I sent him away. There was nothing to arrest, nothing to file, and I didn't trust the silence of paperwork to hold her. That evening Sylvia Prynne came to my office. Uninvited, unhurried. She sat beside me in the worn armchair I'd always meant to have reupholstered, legs crossed, hands unadorned. Her expression had lost its sheen of performance. She looked not defeated, no, but translucent, as though something had passed through her she hadn't been prepared to absorb. "She loved him, didn't she?" she said. No preamble. I didn't reply. Love is a word we use too easily, and not always where it belongs. Instead, I offered her the book. She turned the pages without comment, then read aloud, very quietly, as if afraid of waking someone in the next room. "These fragments I have shored against my ruins." The line hung there. I watched the words settle into her throat. She didn't speak again, just returned the book gently to the table, spine up. Outside, the rain began. That Oxford rain, light as parchment and just as dry once it has passed. It didn't strike the windows so much as arrange itself across them. "I think," she said after a long silence, "he wanted to vanish the old way, the way men like him always vanish. With dignity. Footnotes. No mess." I nodded. Perhaps, but not without injury. He had erased Amelia once, had given her the fire in metaphor, but not the name in ink. A legacy, stolen and reassigned. She hadn't needed to murder him, only to return the silence. Let the fireplace glow falsely. Let the heat kill slowly. A death by metaphor, reenacted as physics. And yet I kept seeing her, not as a killer, not quite, as someone who had been replaced too many times, and finally refused it. Sylvia rose, adjusting the collar of her coat. "I'm not sorry he's dead," she said, "but I am sorry it came to that." I didn't answer. I never do when a person tells me how sorry they are. When she left, I remained seated. There were no files left to examine, no questions that would change the shape of things. I reached for the matchbook she had left behind, struck one, watched it flare. It flickered briefly, all color and hiss, and then went out in the still air. The fireplace was on, but no wood burned, and in the end, that was the point. Not heat, not fire, not even pain, only erasure, and that I think now is a colder end than any flame.